Thank you very much, Richard, and very good morning to friends in UK and other parts of the world according to your time frame. For those in the region, especially from Malaysia, 7 p.m. So I hope all of you have had your dinner already. And yes, thank you so much for joining the seminar today. As Richard has mentioned, I will be sharing about the Muslim and Christian refugee youth, particularly in West Malaysia, and their perception on social well-being through the education in their learning centers. And we are looking at a few faith-based learning centers, mainly in Peninsular Malaysia. So before I share about the results of of the data that I've collected, let me just run through that. I will have a short time on giving some backgrounds on the context in Malaysia. For those who are not familiar with Malaysia, I have some pictures, so you probably will get yourself a little bit more oriented with with different alternative learning centers in Malaysia, and then the problem statement, the research questions, and the scope of our data collection, the result and discussion. And I hope later when I finish both part number 5 and number 6, we can have more discussion and draw out collective learning from the discussion. And I know there are a few of you that are working currently with the refugee learning centers for the last maybe 10 years. So I'm very sure your voice and your thoughts will enrich our discussion. So so for the first part, the background, for those who are now working very closely with the refugees in Malaysia, maybe some of you know that actually we have a huge floods in the mid 1970s when we had refugees from Vietnam coming to Malaysia, and before that there were quite a number of 50,000 from the Philippines, and then there was a drop when many of them were resettled, and then later we have another increase when we had Filipino Muslims coming in the Sabah area, about 45K. And then gradually, well, we also had a small number from Acehers from Indonesia. And gradually we have more and more Rohingyas from Myanmar, and later the Chin from Myanmar coming to Malaysia. I'll share a little bit more on the religious background for different ethnic groups in Myanmar. Okay, so now the title that I gave there is refugee. So I want to make it very clear first about the different definitions. But first, let me just raise the point that Malaysia is not one of the UNHCR 9051 signatories, but there are many refugees in Malaysia, and by definition, you can see here the definition that UNHCR gave to those who are considered as refugee. So when we are talking about refugee in this context, in this research, basically I'm referring to those that have received the UNHCR card. Of course, if we look at the definition in the dictionary, refugees could include many things, but in this particular research, the refugees that are involved are mainly those who have had the cards and the refugee status determination letter. I'll explain a little bit more later. So now, as I mentioned, so I'm referring to those who have already had their application confirmed by the UNHCR, valid as refugees, or those who are still, that have already had their refugee status determination confirmed. They have the letter, but the process finalizing whether they are refugees or not and to get the UNHCR card is still pending. Now, by the end of 2020, there are about 180,000 refugees and asylum seekers. So asylum seekers are those that are holding the letter, and the refugees are those that already received the card from UNHCR. And the majority are from Myanmar, Rohingyas, the majority. And from Myanmar, there are about 23,000 Chin, and they are mainly Christians. Others are from other countries, as you can see the name of the countries there. Okay, so since the majority of the refugees in Malaysia at this particular era, as I mentioned earlier, we have different waves of refugees influx to Malaysia. For those from Myanmar, Normally, those who are Muslims are Rohingyas. Of course, there are also Myanmar Muslims from different parts of Myanmar. And they are also, so for the Christians, normally the ethnic background is the Chin, Kachin, and Karen, and Buddhist Mon, and there are also a few Shan, Rakhine, and Bamar. Bamar is the majority, but in Malaysia for refugees, mainly are the Mons. There are a few Shans too. Okay, so now I just, for those who are not so familiar with the application process, I thought I will show this just to give you some feeling on how the people who first that came to Malaysia later apply for the UNHCR card. Normally, they will first contact their community leader. This is where the religious leaders play a great role, because many of the community leaders also are religious leaders in many sense. And through the community leader, they get their community identity card, and then with this card and the recommendation from the community leader, then they will apply for the refugee status. Now, I think by now you will start to question, if the children have not received the refugee status, can they go to school, right? Because we are looking at the alternative learning center and how these young ones get involved with their schooling. So that's the process. And another important fact about refugees in Malaysia is that almost all refugees in Malaysia settles themselves in rented accommodations. So I showed the wave just now at the early stage when we had refugees from Vietnam. They were all in Pulau Bidong. So initially they were all in the camp. And in many countries, the refugees actually stayed in camp provided by the host country or United Nations, NGOs, and so on. But in Malaysia, the fact that they self-settle themselves indicate that they could afford actually to pay rent. And that also means that they actually have job or able to earn that so that they can pay their rental and able to live in Malaysia. So this is just the distribution of the refugees in Malaysia in 2018. I do not have the 2020 data. So based on the 2018 data, you can see that almost all of them congregate in the main cities in Malaysia. Selangor, Kuala Lumpur, Pulau Pinang, and Johor are all the main cities. That again shows the pull factor for them to come here. In addition to maybe being forced to flee from their country, there are choices to select, whether they go to Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and whatnot. But the economic factor in Malaysia is another reason that draw them to this country. So now the question that I raised earlier, how about the forced migrants that have not received the UNHCR cards or letter? So there is a legal difference between migrant and refugee status, according to Amnesty International. That's very, very general. And actually, there are so many terms that I can screen: undocumented migrants, irregular migrants, regular migrants, and whatnot. The list is very long. So I'm just going to focus between the forced migrants and refugees in Malaysia. And when I say refugee, that includes the asylum seekers. So for those who are not from Malaysia, for your information, Malaysia's Immigration Act 1959-1963 does not distinguish the asylum seekers, refugees, undocumented migrants, or irregular migrants. All irregular entry is considered as an offense. So if someone entered with their international passport and later apply for refugee status, when they started to apply and if they become irregular, let's say their document is no longer valid and so on, then they will start to face the scenario, the Malaysia's Immigration Act will fall onto them. So this having said that if irregular entry is considered an offense, therefore working is also an offense legally. And all the children or adults who wish to go to the university are also denied access to the formal education, to the national education. So that's why in this discussion today, we are looking at alternative learning centers. Now, talking about forced migrants. This is data from International Organization for Migration 2020. And you can see, I'm circling here, that at the end of 2018, there are an estimated 2 to 4 million additional undocumented migrant workers in Malaysia. So remember that I mentioned that many of them self-settled. So now the whole definition of category becomes very blurred, because are the forced migrants also migrant workers, because they are also working to live in Malaysia. So the number is very huge. You can see that between 2 to 4 million undocumented migrant workers. So let's now look at how the young ones pursue their education, despite the fact that they do not have access to national education. So almost half, okay, I mentioned just now 180,000 refugees right now, 2020, and you can see there 46,000 children. 70% of them do not attend any learning centers. That's a big number. And in the areas that is very remote, in the East Malaysia, for example, where Tawau is, Suhakam noted that almost 96% of the Indonesian refugee children were not attending any schools. So I am not looking at the Malaysia in West and East Malaysia, so Malaysia in general, because the data in the East Malaysia is not available. Many data are still unclear. So I'm just focusing on the West Malaysia, whereby there are 128 learning centers located in the main cities, and there are also other states like Kedah, Kelantan, which are not among the 4 main cities that refugees congregate. You can see the learning centers spread all over Peninsular Malaysia. Now, out of these 128 learning centers, only 21 of them are actually offers high school education. By saying high school education, it could vary in various ways. That also includes some vocational education for the high school age teenagers. And 2 that are recognized by UNHCR as secondary education centers are Dignity for Children Foundation and Ideas Academy. When I say they are recognized and they are part of the work closely with the United Nations, some of them also get some funding and support in recruiting teachers and so on. Okay, so when we see the figure just now, back to that 70% do not attend any learning centers. You can see here in general, refugees worldwide at the secondary school level, almost only 24% of them are attending high school education. And in Malaysia, our scores, we have about 16% of high school age teenagers attending. So that looks rather low, but this higher percentage is also contributed by some countries, such as the country that normally offer the third country resettlement. But if we're looking at host country or first country of asylum, such as Malaysia, and what I wrote down here, Pakistan, for example, Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Turkey, Malaysia actually is doing pretty well. You can look at the percentage for, in Pakistan, the secondary education enrollment for refugees is only about 5%. And Turkey, that hosts many refugees, a few million, offered about 13%, offered 13% of the high school age population among the refugees in its country. So I will be, the data that I have collected so far is work in progress, and during COVID-19, the second lockdown, it was quite hard to collect data because it has all to be done virtually. But I managed to get some support from 5 alternative learning centers, and you can see that they are in these areas, Penang, Kuantan, number 2, and number 2 in Greater Kuala Lumpur. That means they belong to the same organization. So those are the names of the alternative learning center. Number 1, right in the in Puchong, is United Arakan Institute of Malaysia. Most of the students are Rohingya students, and actually the number of the high school students is very small. The majority are in the primary school. So in general, most of the learning centers, the 128, actually have primary school students. When they become adult, many of them left and find jobs. Actually, the data of the number of students dropping out in Myanmar is very high. So it is quite common actually for them to find jobs and support their family right after they finish their primary school. So number 2 is Rohingya Education Center. They have 3 centers, and the biggest number of the students are in Penang. That's another big city in Malaysia. For those that have visited Malaysia, I'm sure you enjoy the food in Penang. And we have also in Kuala Lumpur another few small alternative learning centers, Shalom Education Center and Kachin Refugee Learning Center. And for these faith-based learning centers, besides offering the normal track, many of the students are taking IGCSE. They are also offering Bible studies and fellowship. Yeah. And for the Islamic alternative learning centers for Muslim students only, similarly, they also have a lot of classes that offer further understanding and practice of Islamic studies and Islam. And then we also have another group whereby the alternative learning center or centers is founded by Christian NGO. So one example, Al Shaddai Refugee Learning Center is founded by Christian NGO. However, they do not run any Bible studies for the students because they have a diverse backgrounds of students, Muslims, Christian. Later, I will show you, interestingly, that most of the students are Muslims and Christians, even though it's very inclusive, everyone is welcome. And then we have another example of Dignity for Children Foundation. Similar like Al Shaddai, it is an academic setting with a lot of vocational training, founded by leaders who are Christian. However, in the context of the academic content, it's purely academic. Okay, so welcome to Malaysia. For those who have not been to Kuala Lumpur, here are some pictures of different of the 5 learning centers. I work very closely with United Arakan Institute of Malaysia. I'm not sure whether the principal joined us or not today, but I have invited him. And they have about 12 high school students, and the rest are all primary school students. And this is Rohingya Education Center in Kajang. So as I mentioned, the biggest number is in Penang. This is a wonderful network that, so for both of them, the UAIM and for Rohingya Education Center Kajang, most of the students speak Bahasa Malaysia, the national language. And for the REC Kajang, the medium is in the national language. I understood that the UAIM, they are starting to have more and more of their classes in English and are looking towards implementing or having their students to take the IGCSE. Then this is Kachin Refugee Learning Center. As you can see, they are at a hall. This is very typical where when they start their center, they probably use public places. Unlike some centers, along the way, they manage to have fun and they set up schools like UAIM and REC, those 2 that I showed earlier. They have sufficient fund and support that they have set up. They have their own building constructed and running in their own premise. This is Shalom Education Center. Normally, similarly, if not at a hall, they also rent small shop lots and run their classes there. And this is Al Shaddai Learning Center. Al Shaddai Learning Center is one of the biggest refugee learning center that run the high school education. You can see me there with the students promoting Soil Day. And I have been in contact with Al Shaddai for 7 years. And the picture on the left is what they wear at their school. That's the Malaysia school uniform. So they wear the Malaysia school uniform, and they have their teachers. Some of them are also refugees, locals and international. And this is Dignity for Children Foundation. You can see the background. It looks very well constructed. So the dignity is one of those that work very closely with the United Nations. Okay, so now problem statement, as I mentioned, 16%, that's still high because we, of course, want every child to have accessibility to education. And since Malaysia is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, providing education is a must. So despite the irregular status, the Malaysian government do support, or at least do not limit in West Malaysia any NGO to set up alternative learning center. Okay, so as I mentioned, the faith-based I have already introduced you earlier, and we all know, of course, the young youth refugee face enormous challenge. Despite having the UNHCR card, occasionally they also get picked up or put in the detention center. So it is very challenging, and often when I speak with them, they share with me, even when they go to school, they have to be very careful, or they are cautious about the safety on their way to school. So it's an enormous challenge for them. So their social well-being, which also include their emotional well-being, I will explain later the indicators, is very important for us to ensure that these young ones will do well. It's very interesting to know that these young ones are often the translators or interpreters for their family too. One of the founder of the Refugee Learning Center shared with me on how these young ones actually help translate documents for their parents when they're applying to the third country and so on. So their well-being is so critical because they could actually, they get good access to their community, and they could be an ambassador in delivering a lot of information, especially in times of crisis such as COVID-19. I do remember once we had all posters in English, and I say, oh my gosh, we need to translate them into the native language of the refugees. But before that could happen, these young ones are the ones that actually help out their community. So research questions, this is just a part of my PhD research, and this topic is, yeah, we come up with this topic just for this seminar. So I'm trying to hopefully be able to draw out sufficient data for this. So these three questions: how do Muslim, Christian, and Muslim and Christian refugees perceive their social well-being? What is the perceived social well-being of the students according of each faith-based learning center? Remember, there are 5 of them, but because each one is unique, so we can't do direct comparison because the number of the sample is different, the context is slightly different, but at least standalone, we can see the scores. And what are the differences between the female and male Muslim and Christian students' perception on their social well-being? Oh, this is very interesting too. So let's see the data. Okay, before that, the population sample. Forced migrants. So I've explained about on forced migrants, the definition of forced migrants, and that includes the refugees and asylum seekers and children of forced migrants, because some of them, their parents could be forced migrants there, and they are still in different status, irregular status, and so on. They are attending high school education at the Alternative Learning Center. The age is about 14 to 19. I put above because there are some that are slightly above 19, and there are 1 or 2 is between 13 to 14. Other parameters: they have lived in Malaysia at least 4 years, residing in Peninsular Malaysia, and non-residential student. Okay, so in order for me to come up with some indicators or measurement on their social well-being, I based the indicators on these defining concepts. So the fundamental ones, the definition on feeling good and functioning well. So it's not just how we feel, but also how we operate or being able to live well. And that is related to interaction with the social institutions and the community. And I use the case social well-being 5 dimensions, but modify that according to the refugee context in Malaysia. So these are the measured outcomes for the data, the analysis of the data. And then for the indicators, again, as I mentioned, I use the case and modify that. And because we are dealing with young ones that know that they may stay longer in Malaysia for the next 20 or 30 years, or they may go to, they may resettle in the third country. So the social anticipation is changed from social coherence, and there are a few questions developed just for their context. Okay, so this is just a clearer picture of the flow, diagram of the flow, and the definitions. So for social acceptance, basically accepting oneself and others. And then for social contribution, I also include the environmental part, because in Kuala Lumpur right now, especially during COVID-19, there's a lot of work, community work that is also related to the environment. So that's also included. And also because of the climate crisis, I do hope that these indicators can be used in the next many years. Social integration, I think this is one of the typical indicators used, but basically having the belongingness with others, local and their own refugee community. Social actualization, having the capacity and capability to put their thoughts and plans into action together with others. So if they have attended some courses at the school, are they able to actually create livelihood out of that, or find way to earn income and so on, despite the fact that many things it's not legal for them. And anticipation is for the future, as they resettle or relocate to another location, or stay for the next many years, decades in Malaysia. Okay, so of course we do not hope that they stay very long in Malaysia, because I think many of them hope to resettle, but we know there are many cases that they have to stay in Malaysia for 10, 20, and I think some for 2 generations. Okay, research results, as I have already shared with you all, about 2 from having all Muslim students to all Christian students, and Al Shaddai having a mixed students. I am not going to show the result from Dignity for Children Foundation, because my the number of samples is very small. Okay, again, I have 109 participants, and as you can see there, I have 69 Muslim and high school age teenagers, and 38 Christians, and they come from various countries, the majority Myanmar, and I put them Myanmar, non-Rohingya and Rohingya, because we plan to study a little bit more on this in the next time round for this research. Their age, as I mentioned there, so the majority are between 14 to 17. This is the breakdown. I think this is just a repeat on the majority Muslims, majority Christians, and the split Muslim-Christian for Al Shaddai Refugee Learning Center. Okay, so this is the result of the research. Okay, you can see there. Oh, I forgot to put this. Okay, so you can see here. I remember there are 5 domains. I'm going to go through each domain. This is the social acceptance domain. And you can see there the score for the Christian and the score for the Muslim. Greater score means they agree more, it's more positive. Their perception towards the social well-being is more positive. So if we look at 3.76 and 3.78, the difference is very small. But if we take that literally, that means the Muslim youth or teens perceive their well-being for this particular indicator, feeling comfortable with themselves, and believe that people may or may not accept you, is slightly better than slightly more positive than what the Christian teens felt. But here from this result, I think most of them are quite similar, but 2 that are very different, that are slightly big, is that for the Muslim, for the Christian teenagers, they feel happy and more peaceful with themselves and believe that people are kind. Now we move to the social contribution. Again, the difference not so big, but the biggest gap is the Christian youth have a more positive perception on that their behavior has some impact on other people in the community. The third domain is on social integration, and you can see again the difference in the scores. Okay, so for For the Muslim, there's the part on feel that you are an important part of the local community is slightly low. And the two indicators that has bigger gap is that the Christian teens felt belong to the local community a bit more as compared to the Muslim teens, and that if they were to say something, the local community will take them seriously. And for the Muslim teens, as compared to the Christian teen, they feel that they can live out their culture better while adapting to some of the local cultures as compared to the Christian teens. The fourth indicator is on social actualization. Both the Christian and the Muslim teens feel their score is a bit low, so they disagree that the world is becoming a better place. So they feel that the world is not becoming a better place. But on the other hand, they also feel that the society becomes stronger when people partner to work with one another. So very communitarian profile. And then the difference between the two, for the Christian teens, they are more positive that they can make their hope and vision come true in the society they live in. Last one, the last indicator, the last domain is social anticipation. Basically, this is anticipating about Malaysia, staying longer in Malaysia, understanding that they cannot go to the third country, may not, and the environment is changing. So in general, both agree that they can understand, both positive on understanding the society that they live in. For the Muslim teen, a slightly lower score about why they can't go to the third country. And the biggest gap is in the area, even though both agree, but there's still a little bit of gap in understanding that it is important to understand the Malaysian society they live in. Okay. Also, last one, social anticipation. Oh, I have explained this, right? Okay, so that's the last one. And now this is the score. Now we come to, okay, so this is the score. You can see that the difference is not so big. The only main difference is in the social acceptance. So in general, the Christian and the Muslim teens perception for on social well-being are quite similar. The scores, the general scores are very similar, except for the indicators. We can see some indicators are slightly different. I have different scores. And for social acceptance, that's the only one that is a bit different. Okay, so summary, similarities, Muslim and Christian refugee students, both are very positive on the understanding on the environment, believe that society becomes stronger when they work together, and see societies changing continuously. This is their commonalities. And then another commonality is that they both kind of negative or disagree that the world is becoming a better place for everyone. Basically, they feel the world is not becoming a better place for everyone. And these are the differences which I have explained earlier. I went through each one. That's just the summary, whereby the indicator, the scores are very different. I mean, has higher gap. I will not go through this. Okay, so, and this is the mean score for 5 alternative learning centers. And we can't compare them one-to-one because of the different context. But in general, you can see that all schools are having scores more than 3, except for the social integration for the UAIN. So it's a good sign. They are all quite positive with their well-being. But it's not a very strong positive score. Okay, now let's compare between female and male Muslim and Christian students and their perception on well-being. Okay, the first part, we can see that between the male and female, the female students actually are more positive on their perception for social well-being. We minus the scores for the male and minus female, that we get all the negative. That means the female students have a more positive perception. Now we compare between a Christian male and Christian female. You can see there that also similar, their perception quite similar, except for the social contribution. The Christian male felt more positive or have a better view on their contribution to the society. Comparing the Muslim male and Muslim female, you can see that the Muslim female perception is slightly more positive on their social well-being, so all negative. Negative means when we minus this, we get negative. That means it's more positive for the female, except for the anticipation. The male students have better score. Okay, then now we are looking at comparison between Christian male and Muslim male. And you can see the difference in green there. This indicates that the Christian male has a more positive view on their social well-being as compared to the Muslim male. And for the Christian female and Muslim female, their scores are quite similar, just a few, less than 0.2. But for the male, we can see for the social contribution, the difference is 0.33, and the other one, social acceptance, is 0.23. Okay, discussion. I have another 5 minutes to go through the discussion. Basically, it's almost like a conclusion. So I shared earlier, both of them, they have some commonalities in the indicators that they strongly view as very positive. One of it is that the environment is changing and the world is not becoming a better place. They also agree that the society becomes stronger when people work together. But when we look at this, so this last part reflects their communal cultural profile. As their social integration for all learning centers scores the lowest. So there are 5 indicators, and one of it is social integration, and social integration scores the lowest. So it may mean that these students do not get much opportunity to connect or to engage well with the local community. And so it could be that despite having lots of strengths to offer, and their perception on stronger together, most of the time they are able only to contribute or to engage, to be close to, or feel more belongs with the refugee communities. And so I think this is key for alternative learning centers to be able to facilitate the engagement of the refugees with the locals. And I have interviewed some students and the teachers, and indeed I learned from them that this engagement is very important. But for this presentation, I do not include the focus group discussion. Okay, but some of them did share with me about some community activities that they did and sports. And one of the teachers shared with me that he felt that if some national competitions can be more inclusive, including the forced migrants, then that could create an avenue for these young ones, whether they are refugees or non-refugees, locals and international, to meet and get to know one another more. The Muslim refugee students gave lower scores compared to the Christian students in their engagement with the local community. So in general, these 3 questions indicate this lower scores. One is their feeling on being an important part of the local community. They score less than the Christian student. They think that the local community will take them what they want to say seriously. So they do not think as much as the Christian students. and they feel belong to the local community, their score is also lesser than the Christian students. Now, when I look at this mean and these scores, I personally find the result rather surprising, and despite the fact that they are living in Malaysia, a Muslim majority country. And so I think moving forward, I need to organize more interviews and focus group discussion to understand more on what they meant or what they perceived when they selected those answers. Okay, and interestingly, the Christian students' score indicates they feel happier and more peaceful with themselves. The difference is very big between the Muslim and the Christian students, 0.54. And they also have a more positive perceptions on themselves and others. So I wrote here, maybe observation and comparison on classroom management and teaching delivery method may be able to provide greater insights on why there are different perceptions between the Christian and Muslim refugee students when it comes to reflecting about how they feel, whether they are happier or more peaceful. And then another contributing factors that could also lead to the different feeling, emotion, as mentioned there, could be because of the lack of trained teachers. Sometimes the young people, they prefer the student-centered learning that allow them to be more engaged, and sometimes it's very top-down, or the teacher is the one that dominate all the conversation in the class. That all impact how the students feel in the classroom. Also, the fun and proper facilities is another criteria that normally faced by almost every alternative learning centers. A sound curriculum content, especially the one that shall support the youth to resettle in third country or provide livelihood skills, I believe will also contribute positively to how they feel. So we can, not just about how they feel, also about the objective elements that are how well they can live. So I can imagine that if they know they're going to stay in Malaysia for the next maybe 10 to 20 years, with the hope that eventually they will resettle, English will be a language that definitely they hope to learn. And so if English is not the medium part of their curriculum, that will be, I think, will also be at the back of their mind, thinking on how can I live well in the third country if I can't speak English very well, or if the curriculum is not an international curriculum, that will also be something that might be disturbing and disturb their emotion. But on the other hand, for those who are in Malaysia working with the refugees, we all know that the tuition fee for IGCSE examination is very high. So that's also another factor that derails some of the learning centers from moving forward in getting more teachers to run IGCSE program. Okay, so conclusion. I remember reading news that around 6,000 refugees are caned every year in Malaysia. That's very scary for these young ones, thinking about when they walk to school, they go and buy food. At any point, something can happen to them. So they face great challenge, traumatic experience. But despite this fact, I'm so pleased to see that even though their views is not extremely strong positive, but it's still positive views. And I must give credit to all the alternative learning centers, many of them I have worked with, for creating such a safe space for these young ones and creating working together in a journey of hope with them. But I do believe that we all can work together for improvement, and improvement is still needed because the score is not extremely high. And because the learning centers are where they spend most of their time. So the improvement in the learning centers is truly needed. And so civil society has to play our role because there isn't much support from the government in terms of funding and all that. In general, the Christian refugee youth perceive their social well-being slightly more positively compared to the Muslim refugee youth. However, as I mentioned earlier, the difference in the scores is not so big. except for the social acceptance. That's the only one where the Muslim and the Christian teams score score higher. Okay, so there are apparent gaps in their perception for a few indicators. So I have shared that our collective effort is very important. And I think among the refugee alternative learning centers, there has been effort to come together, but I think we need to do more collective effort to learn from one another, such as on developing or conceptualizing the teaching learning content, working together on classroom activities and outside classroom activities, and how to run the center, how to conduct and come together to run a counseling session or training for all the teachers of all alternative learning centers. All these are some of the points that can help running the alternative learning centers and directly improve the refugee students' social well-being. With that, I end my presentation. I want to say thank you to my supervisor, Dr. Thiru. Thanks for coming also for Center for Christian and Muslim Studies, Oxford, and all the 5 refugee learning centers. Thanks so much for supporting me with this data collection, and for one of the interns of RCE Greater Kuala Lumpur for helping me a bit with some of the data. So, Richard, back to you. Thank you.